Okay, so today we have a really wild story for you. It all starts with a local murder investigation, but then it just spirals and spirals until it lands in front of the World Court. We're talking about a high-stakes legal battle between two nations, Djibouti and France, that got incredibly personal.
Right. This is the big question. How does a single criminal case explode into a full-blown international incident? Well, stick around because that's exactly what we're going to unpack. You'll see just how fast things can escalate when you're dealing with heads of state, national honor, and very, very sensitive files.
So let's just quickly run through how we even got here. It all kicks off in 1995 with the death of a French judge in Djibouti. For years, not much happens on the international stage. But then, in 2004, Djibouti formally asks France for their entire investigation file. Things go south fast. By 2005, France has flat out refused, and a French judge does something pretty unbelievable. He summons the president of Djibouti to testify. As you can imagine, that didn't go over well. A year later, Djibouti takes France to the highest court on earth. Now, here's the thing. The International Court of Justice, they weren't asked to solve the murder. Not their job. Their job was to sort out the absolute legal mess that this whole situation had become. And that mess really comes down to two major fights. You've got to understand that this whole thing is playing out based on the legal relationship these two countries already have. They've got a treaty of friendship from 1977 and, even more important, a 1986 agreement about helping each other out in criminal cases. And it's the fine print of those agreements that this whole storm is swirling around. So let's dive into that first battleground, the fight for the file. This is what really lit the fuse on this whole international dispute. Djibouti demanding that France hand over its complete investigation file. Djibouti made its request using a formal tool called a letter rogatory. It sounds fancy, but you can basically think of it as one police department sending a very formal email to another one saying, "Hey, can you send us the evidence file you have on this case?" Normally, this is just routine procedure, but this case was anything but routine. And this slide just lays out the standoff perfectly. Djibouti is on one side saying, hey, our 1986 treaty says you have to give us the file, period. But France comes back and points to a little clause in that same treaty saying, nope, we can refuse if it harms our essential interests. So you have two countries reading the same rulebook and coming to totally opposite conclusions. So what were these mysterious essential interests that France was so worried about? Well, the French judge spelled it out. He said the file was absolutely packed with sensitive stuff. We're talking declassified defense secret documents and witness statements from a whole different case. The judge basically argued that this secret info was so tangled up in the file that he couldn't just hand it over. It would, in his words, be an abuse of French law. Okay, now for the second conflict. And this one was personal. This is where things went from a legal disagreement to what Djibouti saw as a direct insult, the summoning of its sitting president. To get why this was such a huge deal, you have to know about something called head of state immunity. It is a cornerstone of international law. It basically means a country's leader can't be dragged into court in another country while they're in office. It's like a universal diplomatic do not disturb sign that lets them do their job without being harassed. And just look at how this all went down. The summons was sent while the president was in France on an official visit. It wasn't sent through the proper, respectful diplomatic channels. Nope. It was sent by fax. A fax. And it asked him to show up in the judge's office the very next day. I mean, the lack of protocol here is just stunning, and Djibouti saw it as a deliberate slap in the face. And for Djibouti, this was everything. This wasn't just a clumsy mistake. They argued it was a direct attack on their president's immunity, and by extension, an attack on the honor and dignity of their entire country. So, with these two massive complaints, the case finally gets to the International Court of Justice. And after hearing both sides out, the court came back with a ruling that was, well, incredibly complicated. Nobody walked away with a clean win. Before they could get into the drama, the court first had to set the boundaries. They decided, okay, we can rule on the whole fight over the file, and we can rule on that first summons. But they said they could not rule on arrest warrants that were issued later for other officials because those happened after the case was filed and weren't part of the original dispute. So, let's look at the scorecard. First up, the fight for the file. The verdict was split right down the middle. The court said, yeah, France was actually allowed to say no. That whole essential interest thing was a valid reason. However, the court also said France messed up.
It violated a different article of the treaty because it never officially gave Djibouti its reasons for saying no at the time.
And the verdict on the president's summons? Just as complicated. The court said that technically the summons did not violate the president's immunity. Why? Because it was just an invitation to testify, not a threat or an order. But, and this is a huge but, the court also said the way it was done was completely wrong. That facts, the timing, they said it was a failure to show the proper courtesies due to a foreign head of state.
So even though Djibouti won on a couple of really important procedural points, if you look at the big picture, the outcome was a decisive win for France. The court rejected all of Djibouti's main demands, like forcing France to hand over the file, by a massive vote of 15-1.
So what was the punishment for France's one clear screw-up, failing to give reasons? Was it a fine? Sanctions? Nope. The court basically said that the public shaming was the punishment. Just having it written down in an official judgment for the whole world to see was appropriate satisfaction. For Djibouti, the win was getting that official "I told you so."
So why does a case about a dispute from years ago still matter today? Because it's a perfect masterclass in how international law really works. Not just the theory, but the messy reality. And it leaves us with some really important lessons.
First, procedure is everything. France won on the substance but lost on a technicality because they didn't follow the right steps. Second, immunity isn't a magic shield. It protects a leader from being forced to do something, but it doesn't stop another country from asking. Third, courtesy is a really big deal. The court basically said, what you did wasn't illegal, but it was rude, and we're officially calling you out on it. And finally, reasons matter. If you sign a treaty, you have to play by the rules, and that includes explaining yourself.
And all of this leaves us with one last big question to chew on. Djibouti didn't get the file, the summons wasn't thrown out, but they did get the World Court to say that France broke its obligations and acted improperly. In the world of diplomacy, where your reputation and honor are currency, is a win like that a real victory? It's something to think about. Thanks for joining me.